Montana Territory, 1887. Silas Whitfield had been walking up that same gravel path since he was 11 years old. He knew which floorboard on the porch groaned like an old man getting out of bed. He knew that Eleanor Rhodes brewed her coffee thick enough to stand a spoon in, and that her opinions were brewed even stronger. He knew the side gate never latched properly, no matter how many times somebody tried to fix it, and that if he ever bothered to knock at the front door, instead of just walking in, her son Caleb would tease him about it for a week straight. He knew that house the way a man knows the sound of his own name, without effort, without thinking twice. Eleanor's husband, Daniel Rhodes, had passed 3 winters back. It wasn't a long illness, it was fast, the kind of fever that takes a strong man and doesn't ask permission. Since then, Eleanor had kept the ranch running by herself. The cattle, the ledgers, the fences, the garden, she did it all with the quiet stubbornness of a woman who had decided somewhere deep down that falling apart simply wasn't on the schedule. Silas kept showing up anyway. Stopping felt disloyal somehow, like abandoning a post nobody had officially assigned him to. What he didn't know, what he hadn't the faintest idea of, until one particular morning in late August, was that there's a difference between visiting a place 1,000 times and actually looking at it for the first time. He came around the bend near the woodpile that morning and found Eleanor mid-swing with an axe, fighting a stubborn round of pine. The blade skidded sideways off the grain. She reset her stance, swung again, and this time it stuck, buried an inch deep and refused to come loose. She planted a boot against the log and yanked the handle free with the kind of practiced irritation that comes from doing something alone for 3 years and simply getting used to the inconvenience of it. Need a hand with that? That question sat in his mouth before he'd even decided to ask it. Silas stood at the edge of the yard with his hat gripped in both hands, and understood with a clarity he had absolutely not asked for and could not politely decline that he was in serious trouble. He ran through a short list of reasons to turn around and go back the way he came. 3 of them, to be exact, reasonable ones. Then he put his hat back on his head and crossed the yard toward her. "Mrs. Rhodes, let me take that." She looked up. Those pale gray eyes of hers had a way of landing on a person like a verdict. "I've managed on my own for 3 years, Silas." "I know," he said. "Let me do it anyway." She handed him the axe. And if you're looking for the exact moment everything started tilting sideways, that was it. Now, before we go any further, let me back up and tell you how Silas Whitfield ended up practically raised at that kitchen table in the first place, because it matters for everything that comes after. He'd met Caleb Rhodes on their very first day of schooling, both of them 11, both of them scrappy and a little too proud. Some boy twice their size had cornered Silas over a borrowed slingshot, and Caleb, new to town, barely knowing Silas's name yet, had stepped between them without a second thought. That was the whole foundation of it. 10 years of a friendship built on one boy deciding, on instinct, that another boy was worth standing beside. Within a month, the Rhodes homestead had become Silas's second home. Eleanor fed him at every excuse. Daniel steady, unhurried, a man who built his own furniture and never once broke a promise in Silas's hearing, taught him how to mend a fence line properly and how to respect a good tool. The Rhodes family was one of the original homesteads out that way, back before the territory filled up with newcomers chasing land grants. There was a settledness to that house, a permanence the newer places hadn't earned yet. Silas grew up at that table. Eleanor was the one who corrected his table manners, who slid books across to him and told him plainly that reading would do him some good, who asked him real questions and then, unlike most adults, actually waited around for real answers. She wasn't a gentlewoman, not in the soft sense, but she was consistent. And for a boy who'd needed exactly that kind of steadiness at 11 years old, consistency had meant everything. Daniel died 3 years later. Caleb was 17 at the time. Silas showed up the week after the funeral, and the week after that, and simply never stopped because leaving felt like the wrong kind of quiet. He watched Eleanor carry that grief the same way she carried everything else, upright, without asking for more help than she strictly needed, refusing to let the weight show on the outside. He admired that about her. That admiration wasn't new. It had been sitting there for years, unremarkable, unexamined. What was new, what showed up uninvited on that August morning with the axe and the stubborn log, was something else entirely. He spent the following week trying to talk himself out of it. He failed at that particular project on a Thursday when he came by to return a saw he'd borrowed from Caleb weeks earlier. Eleanor answered the door in her work dress. Flour dusted across her knuckles and told him Caleb was down at the sawmill. "I know," he said. "Just came to bring the saw back." She studied him for a beat too long. "Well, come in then. Coffee's fresh." He went in and sat at the same table he'd sat at 100 times, and understood, somewhere around his second cup, that sitting there was never going to feel ordinary again. Here's the problem, though, and it's the kind of problem that doesn't have an easy exit. Caleb wasn't just some acquaintance Silas could quietly avoid. He was Silas's closest friend on this earth. 10 years of shared history, 10 years of knowing each other at their worst and choosing every single time to stay. That kind of friendship doesn't require daily maintenance. It's built out of something sturdier than routine, which meant Silas absolutely could not tell him. He'd told Caleb everything for a decade. Every mistake, every doubt, every half-formed decision. Caleb had listened to every bit of it and handed back opinions that were sometimes dead right and sometimes way off base, but always honest. He tried once in late September, sitting on the split-rail fence at the edge of Caleb's land, down where the creek bends, the spot they always went to when something needed saying out loud. "Can I run something by you?" Silas said. "You're going to whether I agree or not," Caleb said. "What would you do if you had feelings for somebody?" And the whole situation was complicated. Caleb glanced sideways. Complicated how? She married? No. Spoken for? No. Then what exactly is complicated about it? Silas looked at the water instead of answering directly. The situation. Caleb waited him out. The way a man does when he's known someone for 10 years and has learned patience is usually the fastest route to the truth. "Who is she?" "Nobody you know," Silas said, which, in 10 years of blunt honesty between them, might have been the single most dishonest sentence he'd ever spoken. Caleb gave him a look that said he wasn't buying it, not entirely, but was willing to file the mystery away and revisit it later. "Well," Caleb said finally, "if she's not married and not promised to some other fool, then the only complicated part of this is you. You've always had a talent for making easy things hard." He tossed a stone into the creek. Silas threw one farther. Caleb skipped twice as many times. They sat there another hour without bringing it up again, which Silas privately decided was both the best and the most maddening thing about having a friend who knew him that well. He went back the following Saturday to finish splitting the rest of the woodpile. He told himself this was purely practical. Winter comes early in Montana, and wood doesn't split itself. Caleb worked Saturdays at the mill. It was the obvious neighborly thing to do, and had absolutely nothing to do with the fact that he'd thought about Eleanor Rhodes's gray eyes something like 300 separate times since that morning by the woodpile. He told himself all of that. He believed none of it. He went anyway. Eleanor opened the door wearing the expression of a woman expecting somebody else entirely. "Caleb's at the mill?" she said. "I know. Came to finish the wood?" "Silas? You don't have to keep—" "I know," he said. "Where's the axe?" She pointed toward the barn without another word. He worked for 2 solid hours. At midday, she came out with a jug of water and a plate of cornbread, and sat on the porch step with her arms folded, watching him with that direct, appraising look of hers, the same look that had terrified him at 11 and impressed him at 17, and was currently doing something to him he had zero intention of examining in broad daylight. "You're better at that than I am," she said. "Most people would be. I was using a perfectly good angle. You were making it harder than it needed to be." She considered a few possible replies before landing on one. "Story of my life," she said, and she meant it about the firewood. He heard an entirely different sentence. He set the axe down. She looked at him. He looked back. 4 full seconds passed where neither one said a word, and that quiet Montana afternoon seemed to hold its breath around them, like it, too, was having 2 separate conversations at once. Then she stood up. "Lunch in 10 minutes if you're staying." "Yes, ma'am." He followed her inside, and if his heartbeat was doing something entirely unreasonable the whole way in, he managed barely not to let it show. It was Ida Pruitt at the general store who nearly blew the whole thing wide open. Ida had run that store for close to 30 years, which meant she possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of everyone's business, gathered patiently over 3 decades of selling folks flour and listening while she rang it up. Silas was there buying nails when Ida said, entirely too casually, "You've been spending an awful lot of time out at the Rhodes place lately. Caleb's my closest friend." That particular hum of hers meant she'd noticed something and wasn't about to let it go unremarked. "The woodpile needed splitting," Silas offered. Same hum, slightly longer this time. "Something you're trying to say, Mrs. Pruitt?" She dropped his nails into a paper sack with the serenity of a woman who'd already made her point without technically saying it. "Eleanor Rhodes is a fine woman," she said. "That's all I'll say on it." Silas paid and left in a hurry, and walked directly into Caleb on the boardwalk outside. "You look like something's eating you alive," Caleb said by way of hello. "I'm fine. You look like a man who's done something and can't figure out how to take it back." "I haven't done anything." Caleb tilted his head. 10 years, Silas. I know your face is better than you do. What's that supposed to mean? Means you've got the look of a man thinking hard about doing something he's already half-talked himself into. What'd Ida say to you? She said your mother's a fine woman, Silas said, because it was true, and because saying it straight to Caleb's face seemed like the only honest way to find out how it landed. Caleb went completely still, then something shifted across his face, not anger exactly, not amusement either, but a man working through arithmetic in real time. Huh? Caleb said. One syllable. He picked his package back up and kept walking. Silas stood rooted on the boardwalk, watching him go. Then Caleb stopped at the corner and glanced back over his shoulder. You coming or not? To where? Supper. Mama's making venison stew. And he kept walking, leaving Silas standing there wondering what exactly a man is supposed to do after he's just accidentally confessed to having feelings for his best friend's mother, except apparently follow him to supper anyway. Now let's pause here for just a second, because I think this moment deserves it. Caleb didn't lash out. He didn't demand Silas disappear from their lives. He invited him to supper. That's a much harder thing to pull off than it sounds, and it tells you nearly everything you need to know about the kind of man Caleb Rhodes was raised to be. This story keeps finding its way to viewers in places I never expected: Kenya, Brazil, Vietnam, Poland, corners of the world I couldn't have pictured when I first sat down to write it. If you're watching this from somewhere far from where this story is set, drop your country in the comments below. I read every single one. Now back to that supper, because it was about to become the single most uncomfortable meal Silas Whitfield had ever choked down. Eleanor had made venison stew, and as always, it was excellent. She cooked the way she did everything else, with complete unshowy competence and absolutely no interest in being complimented for it. The pot sat in the middle of the table exactly where it always sat on Thursday evenings, and everything appeared exactly as it always had, except that Caleb now knew or suspected, or was somewhere in the middle of figuring out and not knowing which one it was made the whole evening worse. They sat in their usual places. Caleb here, Silas there, Eleanor at the head of the table. Supper unfolded the way it had 100 times before, except Silas had become suddenly painfully aware of every single motion of his own hands. He passed the biscuits without being asked. He always passed the biscuits without being asked. It was automatic, thoughtless, 10 years of habit. But now he found himself second-guessing whether that gesture had ever meant anything at all, or whether it had just now, this very evening, started meaning something. Good biscuits, he said, because the silence needed filling. Eleanor glanced at him. Same recipe I always use, I know. Always good, though. Caleb made a noise that was almost, but not quite, a cough. How's the mill running? Silas asked, because somebody had to say something. Fine, Caleb said. How's the wood pile? Done? All of it. All of it. That's a whole lot of wood to finish in one afternoon. It was a whole lot of logs, Silas said. Eleanor looked back and forth between the two of them. Is something the matter with you two tonight? No, they said in exact unison. Eleanor had raised Caleb for 22 years and known Silas for 10 of them. She studied them both with the expression of a woman who has correctly diagnosed a problem and is simply deciding how long to let the patient squirm before offering the cure. She picked her fork back up. Pass the potatoes, Silas. He passed the potatoes. Caleb watched him do it like it was a crime in progress. Supper continued on agonizingly, and Silas privately decided it was the longest meal of his entire natural life, and also that the stew was genuinely some of the best he'd ever eaten, and that he would remember that particular Thursday until the day he died. Caleb brought it up 2 days later down at the creek, same spot they always went. He skipped a stone first, 4 bounces, then settled onto the flat rock and stared at the water for a good while. So, he finally said. So, Silas echoed. My mother's Caleb, let me, my mother, Caleb said again, cutting him off. You've got feelings for my mother. Silas didn't answer. There wasn't a version of an answer that would make this any easier to hear. Caleb was quiet a long stretch. She's 40 years old, he said eventually. I know you're 22. I know that too. That's 18 years, Silas. I know. Caleb threw another stone. This one didn't skip at all, just dropped straight in with a heavy plunk, and he stared at the water like it had personally let him down. You've been coming around our house since we were both 11, Caleb said. She's fed you 1,000 meals, told you when you were being a fool. She's my mother. I know, Silas said. I'm not asking you to be comfortable with any of it. I'm not even sure I'm comfortable with it myself. I just couldn't keep looking you in the eye and lying about it. Caleb went silent for a long while. A hawk circled somewhere overhead, riding the wind above the ridgeline. And here's the part of this whole story that sticks with me most, if I'm honest. Silas told the truth in the exact moment it would have been so much easier to keep quiet. 10 years of real friendship, and he didn't let the fear of losing it turn into an excuse to lie. That's the actual measure of the thing. Does she know? Caleb asked finally. No. Are you going to tell her? Silas looked out at the water. I don't know. Caleb turned a smooth stone over in his fingers, studying it instead of his friend. She's been alone 3 years, he said. Quieter now, talking more to the creek than to Silas. She does everything by herself and never once complains about it. And I know it isn't easy for her. I know that better than anybody. I won't hurt her, Silas said. That's the one promise I'll make you right now, and I intend to keep it. Caleb nodded once, and that was that for the day. They sat by the creek another hour without another word passing between them. It didn't need any more words. It was already enough. Eleanor Rhodes was not a woman who missed much. She'd noticed, back in August, the way Silas had paused at the edge of the yard before crossing it, that half-second beat that ran a little too long to be nothing. She'd filed it away the way she filed anything that required more thought than she had time for in the moment, and said nothing about it. She'd noticed at supper, too, the biscuits, the potatoes, the way Caleb had been watching Silas the entire meal like a hawk of his own. She said nothing then either. Not because she didn't have words for it, but because some things need room to breathe before they're ready to be handled out loud. There was something else too, something she only turned over in private, lying awake some nights next to a cup of coffee she'd poured and then forgotten to drink. She noticed that when Silas was in a room, she sat up a little straighter, that she thought twice about what she said before saying it. That the morning with the axe had stayed lodged in her mind far longer than she was entirely comfortable admitting to herself. She was 40 years old. He was 22. She had known him since he was a boy eating soup at her table with his elbows planted where they shouldn't be. She ran through those facts the same careful way she balanced her ledgers at the end of each month. They didn't add up, not by any accounting she knew. And yet one evening in October, she was hauling an armload of split wood in from the pile Silas had cut. When she heard the side gate creak open behind her, she didn't turn around. Caleb's not here. I know, Silas said. He came up and took the wood straight out of her arms without asking permission first. She let him. He carried it up to the porch, and they stood there together in the October evening, looking out at the mountains going purple at the edges. Silas, she said, whatever it is you're thinking? I know, he said. That stopped her cold, because she'd taught him that exact phrase herself. I know the words he used whenever he understood exactly what he was walking into and had already decided to walk into it anyway. She looked at this young man who had been coming to her home for a full decade, who knew which gate stuck and how she liked her coffee and precisely when to say absolutely nothing. I'm 18 years older than you, she said, and caught herself nearly saying 22 before correcting the number, which told her that even her own arithmetic had gone crooked over this. He looked at her steadily. I counted 2. They stood there in the fading October light, and she thought plainly, well, that settles that. Winter arrived with snow and the particular hush that settles over the Montana high country once the passes close. Silas came by on Tuesdays now. Nobody had ever formally agreed to that arrangement. It had simply become true on its own, the way habits do when nobody's paying close attention. He and Eleanor spent an afternoon repairing a stretch of fence the wind had knocked flat, working alongside each other with the easy rhythm of two people who'd learned each other's pace without ever discussing it. Caleb rode over that afternoon and found them afterward on the porch with mugs of coffee, sitting in the same 2 chairs, not quite close enough to touch, but close enough that Caleb stood in the doorway a moment with the look of a man actively wrestling his own feelings about the whole arrangement. Coffee? Eleanor offered. Sure, Caleb said. He dragged a 3rd chair out from inside and sat down on his mother's other side, and drank his coffee, and watched the snow fall on the valley. Good fence work, he said eventually. Silas fixed the east post, Eleanor said. Been leaning since summer. Caleb glanced at Silas. Silas looked hard at the falling snow. Been thinking, Caleb said, to nobody in particular, about my father? Eleanor went very still. He used to say Silas was the most reliable person he'd ever met. Caleb went on, stayed it back when Silas was 15 and fixed our barn roof without anybody asking him to. He took a slow sip of coffee, said any man who fixes something without being asked is worth keeping around. The snow kept falling. The mountains had vanished behind it entirely. Eleanor stared into her cup. Silas stared at the fence post he'd mended, and Caleb stared at the snow. And the 3 of them sat there in the particular quiet of people who have said something enormous without ever using the actual words for it. Nobody moved for a long time. Nobody needed to. It was enough for the moment as it was. It was February when Eleanor finally said it out loud. The worst of the cold had started to loosen its grip. That first hint of a Montana thaw creeping in at the edges. Silas had been coming by Tuesdays and Thursdays both. By then, and Caleb had long since, stopped making the face he used to make at first, had started folding Silas naturally into every conversation about the ranch, the way a man does once he's made peace with a decision and stopped relitigating it in his head. Eleanor and Silas were alone on the porch, Caleb off at the mill, watching the late winter light stretch across the ridgeline. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Anything?" She took a moment. "Why me?" she said. "Out of every woman in this county your own age, women without a grown son, women without—" She gestured vaguely at herself, at the gray threading through her temples, at the whole weight of her 40 years, without all of this. "Why?" He thought about it before answering, which she appreciated. "Because you're the realest person I've ever known," he said. "You've been that way since I was 11 years old. You told me the truth when I needed to hear it, even when it stung. You asked me questions that meant something and actually waited to hear the answers." He looked out at the mountains. "I kept meeting women my own age and wondering why none of it ever felt like this. Took me a long while to realize I'd been measuring every single one of them against you without ever admitting it to myself." Eleanor kept her eyes on the mountains. "Silas, I'm 40 years old. I know, you're 22. I know that too." She turned to look at him, those steady gray eyes that had never once lied to him. "Where were you 20 years ago?" she whispered, and then she laughed. A real laugh, the kind that only comes out when something is simultaneously ridiculous and completely true, and there's no better response available. He understood she was laughing because the whole situation genuinely was absurd, and because she'd just said something out loud that had been sitting in her chest for months. 20 years ago, I was 2 years old," he said. "I know," she said, still laughing. "That's exactly the problem." "Is it a problem?" he asked. The laughter faded slowly. She looked at him with the expression of a woman who has run every column of the ledger and found it refuses to balance and has finally decided she no longer cares whether it does. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I genuinely don't know." He nodded once. "That's enough for now." And she looked at this young man who had learned "I know" from her own mouth and was somehow already using it better than she ever had, and thought, yes, it really is enough. Caleb came to find Silas at the creek in March. He skipped a stone first 4 bounces, then sat on the rock and studied the water a while. "Been thinking," Caleb said. "About what?" "My father, what he used to say, about reliable men." He tossed another stone. "About my mother too," he paused. "She's been different this winter. Better different. Like something that switched off 3 years back just quietly switched back on." Silas said nothing. "That you?" Caleb asked, not accusing, just genuinely curious. "I don't know," Silas said. "Maybe." Caleb nodded slowly. "I want to say something," he said, "and it's taking a fair amount of effort to get it out, so I'd appreciate it if you didn't make this strange." "I'll try." "You'd better do better than try." Caleb was quiet a moment. "My father was the finest man I ever knew. When he died, my mother kept moving forward. She always does, but something in her went quiet. I've watched her for 3 years, wondering if it would ever come back on." He turned the stone over once in his hand. "I think it has." Silas looked at the water. "She deserves to be happy," Caleb said. "That's the whole of it, and I'm not going to be the reason she isn't." He looked at Silas directly. "Don't make my life strange over this. I'll do my best. You're still my closest friend," Caleb said, standing and offering his hand. "And if you ruin that for me, I won't forgive you easily." "I know," Silas said, and shook it. And it wasn't the handshake of 2 casual acquaintances. It was the handshake of 2 men who'd known each other since they were 11 and had just navigated something that could have wrecked everything between them, and hadn't. "Good," Caleb said, settling his hat back on. "Now come to supper. Mama's making chicken, and I refuse to eat alone while the 2 of you make eyes at each other across my table." "We don't make eyes at each other." Caleb gave him the exact look he'd been giving him for 10 straight years, the one that meant "you absolute fool." "You've been making eyes at each other since August," he said. "I noticed right off. I want that on the record." Silas laughed, Caleb laughed, and they walked back toward the Rhodes homestead together, the same way they'd been walking places together since they were both 11 years old, and somehow nothing had changed, and everything had changed, and it all fit together exactly right. It happened on an evening in May. Caleb had ridden into town. Spring was doing what Montana springs do once they finally arrive. Everything green and loud with birdsong, the peaks standing clear against the sky for the first time in months. Eleanor and Silas sat together on the porch in the 2 chairs that had, somewhere over the winter, quietly become theirs, coffee going cold in their hands, watching the last light settle over the ridge. They'd been sitting in comfortable silence a good 20 minutes, the kind of silence that doesn't need filling, that is itself a form of conversation. "Silas," she said, "I've run the numbers in my head more times than I can count this winter. Lying awake next to coffee, I never got around to drinking." He waited. It doesn't add up, she said. You're 22. I'm 40. You're my son's closest friend. There are easily 40 good reasons this makes no sense at all. I know, he said. I've been searching for one reason that outweighs the rest of it. Did you find it? She looked out at the mountains a long moment. I think I did. What is it? She turned to face him, those gray eyes, direct and honest as ever, without a shred of pretense in them. That I'm happy, she said. When you're near, I'm happy in a way I'd genuinely forgotten was possible. I'm 40 years old, Silas. I've spent my whole life being practical. Made the sensible choice every single time it was offered to me. She paused. I think I'm finished being practical. Silas set his cup down. He stood, crossed the short distance of porch between their two chairs, and held out his hand. She looked at it. Then she took it and let him pull her gently up to standing, and she stood before him with the Montana evening at her back and the mountains turning gold behind her shoulder. He kissed her slow and careful, the way a man kisses someone for the very first time when he's been thinking about it for months and wants very badly to get it right. She kissed him back, not tentatively, not with any hesitation at all, but with the full conviction of a woman who has already run every column of the ledger, already made her decision, and has no intention whatsoever of reversing it. The evening held them there together, gold light fading to violet, spring air moving soft around them. When they finally stepped apart, neither one said a word because there wasn't a sentence in the world better suited to the moment than the quiet itself. Then from down the road came the unmistakable sound of Caleb's horse. Eleanor stepped back and smoothed her skirt. Silas picked his coffee cup back up. By the time Caleb came up the porch steps, the two of them were looking out at the mountains exactly the way they always did. Caleb glanced between them, then out at the peaks himself. Evening, he said. Evening, Eleanor said. Evening? Silas said. Caleb made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a cough. Right? He said, and picked up his own cold coffee, and drank it anyway without complaint. They were married that September in the little church at Millfield Crossing on a Saturday, with what felt like half the county packed into the pews because that was simply the kind of town Millfield Crossing was. Caleb stood up beside Silas at the altar, and not reluctantly, genuinely. It had taken him the better part of 4 months to arrive at genuinely, and he'd gotten there by watching his mother the way he'd never quite thought to before, not as his mother, but as a woman living her own life. He'd watched her laugh more that spring than she had in the whole 3 years since his father passed. He'd watched something come back on behind her eyes. He'd watched Silas beside her, careful, honest, steady, the exact same way Silas had always been with him, and understood finally that his best friend loving his mother wasn't a loss at all. It was something gained that he hadn't even known he was missing. Eleanor came down the aisle in a deep blue dress, the exact color of a clear Montana sky at midday. Silas stood at the altar and looked at her and completely forgot how breathing worked. Caleb beside him muttered under his breath, "Breathe, you fool." Silas breathed. He said his vows the way he said everything that mattered to him, plainly, without flourish, looking straight at Eleanor the entire time. She said hers, looking right back at him with those same gray eyes that had never once told him anything but the truth. Walking back up the aisle afterward, Caleb shook Silas's hand at the church door, the same handshake as that day by the creek, and said, "Welcome to the family officially." "I've been part of this family since I was 11, Silas said. "That was different," Caleb said. "How's that different?" Caleb considered the question with tremendous exaggerated seriousness. "Before," he said, "you were just the annoying one who ate all our biscuits. Now you're my stepfather." Silas stared at him. Caleb held it for a solid 4 seconds before he cracked, and they were both laughing in the church doorway on Silas's wedding day. Eleanor, standing a few feet off talking with Ida Pruitt, turned to watch her son and her new husband doubled over laughing together, and shook her head with the look of a woman who had made her decision fully aware of exactly what she was signing up for. And what she'd signed up for was a man who chopped her firewood without being asked, who learned the shape of her silences, who showed up on Tuesdays out of pure habit and never once needed thanking for it, a man who had also, somewhere along the way, and entirely without anyone planning it, become something more to her son than just his oldest friend. That evening, back on the porch, the three of them in their 3 chairs, watching the Montana mountains do what they always did at dusk, Caleb said quietly, "Dad would have liked this." Nobody spoke for a good while after that. Then Silas said, "Tell me about him." And Caleb did, and Eleanor listened. And the evening held all 3 of them there together while the peaks went gold, then violet, then dark, and the stars came out over Millfield Crossing one by one, and it was, by every measure Eleanor Rhodes had ever used to judge a thing, exactly right. Silas Whitfield walked around the corner of a woodpile one August morning and saw something he never expected to see. He counted 40 good reasons to turn around and walk away. He counted 3 of them out loud. Then he crossed the yard anyway. That's the whole of it. A man who refused to walk away. A woman who finally gave herself permission to stop being practical. A son who loved his mother enough to want her happy, even when her happiness turned out to be the complicated kind. I think about Caleb often, about what it must have cost him to sit by that creek and choose don't hurt her over stay away from her. That's a deeper kind of love than most people manage, the kind that outweighs whatever made sense on paper. And I think about that friendship, Silas and Caleb's, what it means that it didn't just survive what happened. It came out the other side of it, larger than it started. That's the thing about the good ones. Tested right, they hold. There's something worth saying about honesty here, too. Silas told his best friend the truth in the exact moment silence would have been so much easier. He didn't let a decade of history become an excuse to hide. He said the hard thing out loud and let Caleb decide what to do with it. And that more than anything else in this whole story is what real friendship actually looks like. Not comfortable, just honest. So say the true thing when it counts. Show up on the days nobody asked you to. Fix what needs fixing before somebody has to ask. And if it ever happens that your best friend falls for someone close to you, give it room. Sit by the water a while, and when you're ready, throw the stone that skips the farthest. Thanks for spending this time with me. Wherever you're watching from, I'm glad you were here for it. Until next time, keep writing.